Tyreek Hill and Drake London have a wide range of fantasy outlooks. They could be top 10 wide receivers or big disappointments in 2025. We talk through the top 6 toughest wide receivers to rank on today's episode of Locked On Fantasy Football.
You are Locked On Fantasy, your daily NFL fantasy podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into the Locked On Fantasy Football Podcast. Thank you for making us your first listen every day. I'm one of your co-hosts, Michelle Magdziuk, and when I'm not doing this, I'm a researcher and fantasy analyst with NFL Network.
And I'm your other co-host, Vinnie Iyer. When I'm not doing this, I'm writing about NFL fantasy and betting for sportingnews.com.
Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Today, we're going to be discussing the top 6 toughest wide receivers to rank for 2025 fantasy football drafts. We already did this exercise with running backs on Monday's show. So if you missed that, go listen. And then we'll do quarterbacks and tight ends the rest of this week. But starting with the toughest guy to rank at the wide receiver position, it has to be Tyreek Hill, because we know he has the capability to be the wide receiver 1 overall. But we also saw him completely fall off last year as the wide receiver 35 in points per game in 2024. Now, he was battling a wrist injury pretty much all season long with the ligament damage, which he underwent surgery after the season. Apparently, he was also dealing with an ankle injury, too, in the second half of the season. So was it age? Was it just a bad offense last year for the Dolphins? Was it the injuries? Who knows? Where are you leaning here with Tyreek Hill?
Yeah, I mean, the reports are good so far. I mean, there's been some positive things coming out of the owners' meeting in terms of what Tyreek Hill is doing to prep for the season, and Mike McDaniel expects him to be there, right? So I think everything is kind of passed with the trade rumors and all the things we're talking about. Tyreek maybe could get an extension or a rework contract down the line that makes him a little happier in Miami, but he can't say this is not a fruitful offense for him when everything's on point. Last year we had Tua Tagovailoa injury, so that kind of threw off the offense, and they were a little bit gun shy with Tua when he returned and not throwing the ball downfield. And obviously it was just a mess. And I think that's why you're hearing a lot of rumors coming out of that owners meeting about Mike McDaniel needs to put it up another level, right? I mean, he was great with moving Tyreek Hill around before the snap and getting him open. Now everyone's seen that a little bit, so they need to take it to the next level, maybe running some routes he's comfortable with from the Chiefs. So again, when this guy's healthy, he's special. I don't think he's really slowed down all that much. I mean, it's going to eventually happen, right? I mean, he's getting up there. He's got a lot of mileage in Kansas City and Miami. But look, this is a pretty aggressive ranking for him right now. I mean, jumping up from 35, I think it's fair to say he's wide receiver 13. I mean, that's shocking if you just think about it there, that he's not even a top 12 wide receiver. So already I think people have adjusted his value to where it should be. And I think his upside definitely says he can be well above wide receiver 13. I think it's his downside that has people taking pause. But I like that value right now. If he creeps into like the 8 to 10 range, a little too rich for me. But if he stays 13 to 16, I'm going to love it here for Tyreek Hill as a great value.
Yeah, I think if he stays in that range in consensus rankings, I'll probably have him ranked higher than consensus, because I do think he can get back to what he was. I mean, he was the wide receiver 1 overall in 2023, wide receiver 3 in 2022. We know he was fantastic with the Chiefs. Like, I don't think he just completely fell off. We still saw those big games. It's great. I mean, the first week of the season, it started off so hot, right? 130 yards and a touchdown. And then it was just a lot of disappointments in a row. But towards the end of the year, he put up a couple more big games as well. So I do think he has it plenty left. We know this offense needs him, right? He's going to get the targets. And as long as they don't go back to using Jonnu Smith and getting him 10 targets a game, which clearly didn't work, like get Tyreek Hill 10 targets a game, that's a much better plan for your offense. Then I do think he can get back up there as a top 5 wide receiver, but I'll have him ranked around wide receiver 10-ish. So again, I think I'll be higher than consensus once we get into draft season. Now, the second toughest wide receiver to rank is Drake London. Right now, he's sitting at, I'm trying to see what his consensus ranking is.
And
yeah, wide receiver 10. So he's pretty
I
high
never
now.
thought I'd see that. Yeah, but
Yeah.
we're here.
Last year, he did finish as a wide receiver 5 overall, but wide receiver 14 in average points per game on the season, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we talked about this, I think, in a show last week that Drake London's end of season numbers were really, really skewed by 2 really big games. And one of those came in week 18. So it wasn't even fantasy season for most people. And in that week 18 game, there was no Darnell Mooney. And he got 18 targets in that game, right? Because he's the only guy there. Now, he has Michael Penix Jr. for next year, it looks like. I mean, Kirk Cousins is still on this team, but you would assume they're going to Penix for their starting quarterback. And they didn't really make any other changes, right? And we saw him in the last 2 games of the season with Penix, or the last 3 games. And those last 2 games were awesome for Drake London. So what are your thoughts on Drake London next year? He had 158 targets last season. Is that reasonable to expect he'll be utilized that often in 2025?
Yeah, there's a lot of variables that come into play here. You mentioned the Mooney injury late in the season. You mentioned the Michael Penix connection there. It had a transition from Kirk Cousins to Penix in the middle of the season. Now, Kirk Cousins, as Michelle mentioned, is on the team, but he's not expected to report to any of their offseason programs here. So clearly it's Michael Penix's offense to go forward. Now, the targets can be there. I mean, Pitts is still not very good, right? And he could be moved at some point. And you have Mooney, who's a good 2, and he had his moments, like he rose into wide receiver 3 category on average when he was healthy. And Mooney's injury issues resurfaced there at the end of the season. So I don't see anyone else. Like, we looked at it, okay, Pitts was going to get a lot. That did not materialize at all in the new offense, where Pitts, they were just tired of throwing him and forcing him into the action when he wasn't coming through. So I think you could see another massive target share and volume here for Drake London. Again, I'd like to see him put up those scores consistently. He's a big body here. Take advantage of that. So I think he's about where he should be, I think, at wide receiver 10. I mean, that bumps him up a few spots from last year, but not in terms of the overall scoring. If you look at 5-14, kind of right in the middle is 10, and maybe that's why he's ranked there. But I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, he is a wide receiver 1 clearly on his team, and I think that puts him in the top 12 firmly here. So now, if I had to go between these 2 guys, Drake London and Tyreek Hill, look, I think London has as much upside right now as Tyreek Hill. I mean, he is a number 1, and Penix is going to target him a ton. Keep that in mind, that it's a younger quarterback. He's going to really throw to one guy a lot, where you do have Waddle. We'll see. It really comes down to, do I trust Waddle or Mooney more as the number 2? But I think what I would like is Drake London not to go above this, because I don't want to spend too much more, and Tyreek Hill not to go too much higher either, because right now, for what their cost is, they're very good values with their upside.
Yeah, I would still lean the Tyreek Hill route, because we know if Tyreek Hill goes off, I mean, he can easily put up 1,700 yards and 12, 15 touchdowns, right? I do think Drake London's kind of capped at maybe his best season could be like 1,310, which would be awesome. But still, I slightly lean Tyreek Hill side, and I'm only slightly lower on Drake London than his consensus ranking of wide receiver 10 at the moment. I have him around, 12 to 15, but this is the issue with trying to rank him, is like, rank these 3 guys for me: Drake London, Terry McLaurin, and Jackson Smith-Njigba.
Yeah, that's hard. I mean, it's really hard. I mean, I would say the guy that has the clear path to targets now, especially with the moves, right? Deebo Samuel and Cooper Kupp are in those situations we can't ignore, is Drake London. I mean, their status quo, as you mentioned, is there. And again, the upside definitely is there. I mean, he's got the size, strength, speed, all the things that you're looking for there as a number 1 receiver. And again, the gap could be pretty huge between them and the rest, but I think Kupp and Samuel could help kind of bridge that gap even as receivers in that target share in those typical situations. So I do like London a little bit more than those 2 guys because of that reason.
I think that's fair. I right now I have Terry McLaurin ahead of Drake London, and then London ahead of Jackson Smith-Njigba. But I could see me switching those. I don't think I'm as worried about Deebo Samuel stealing too much work from Terry McLaurin as you are. But yeah, it's going to be a close one. Those are definitely going to be tough decisions. We have 4 more wide receivers to discuss that are the hardest guys to rank for 2025. We'll get to those right after a quick break. This episode of Locked On Fantasy Football is brought to you by the Gametime app. Buying tickets to your favorite event should not be stressful. Game Time is the fast and easy way to buy tickets for all the sports, music, comedy, and theater near you. With killer deals on last-minute tickets and the best price guarantee, you can stop stressing over the tickets and start getting hyped for the fun you'll have. It is the fastest growing ticketing app in the country for a reason. I just use them to buy tickets for the Astros that I'm going to today. I'm going to be using those tickets and going to the game. Very excited, but I use this app because it's the best one out there. It was definitely the cheapest option. I got my tickets for way cheaper than I could find them elsewhere. I got to see the view of my seat before I buy, so I know exactly what to expect before I arrive. It took me seconds to buy tickets. Super easy to use the app. And then they have the best ticket coverage in the business in case anything goes wrong. They have event cancellation protection, 24-hour return guarantee, and even job loss assurance. You get to take the worries and the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Just download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKDOWNNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKDOWNNFL. That's LOCKEDON NFL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game Time. All right, let's continue discussing the toughest wide receivers to rank for 2025 fantasy football drafts. And our third wide receiver on this list, it's Chris Godwin. And maybe he should have even been higher because he is extremely difficult to figure out where to place him in our rankings. He just turned 29 years old, so we don't really have to worry about age just yet. But he dislocated his ankle in week 7, missed the rest of the season. So I'm not too worried about the injury, right? It's not like it's an ACL tear or anything like that. He should be okay by the start of the season. And last year in the limited games he did play, he played 7 games last season, averaged 16.1 fantasy points per game. That was good enough to be wide receiver 2 in points per game behind only Jamar Chase. Now, again, very small sample size. And 4 of those 7 games were very good. And then 3 were not so great for him. So it was kind of up and down. Different OC now again. And that's really kind of the only change. I guess Jalen McMillan, second year, could be stealing some targets from him. What are your feelings about Chris Godwin?
Yeah, when you look at it in terms of the average scoring, he was wide receiver 11. So that put him right there while he was healthy with A.J. Brown and Brian Thomas Jr. in half-point PPR. Now, the interesting thing is the guy right behind him with that three-way tie for 11 at 14 we mentioned before was Drake London. So he's putting up better numbers early in the season when he was there. But as Michelle brought up, there are 2 variables that are significant here. There's no more Liam Cohen. I get they promoted within. We talked about the guy coming in and trying to get it going the same way Cohen did. He's promoted from within. So we're looking at the potential there with Josh Gizzard. Are they going to be able to replicate that kind of split? But then McMillan, I think, is a real thorn in the side of both of these guys. Like, I think he's legitimately the third receiver they've been looking for. I liked him a lot at Washington. Then he just got open all the time down the stretch last season when Godwin was hurt. So, look, there's probably fades Kate Otten out of the picture here as they go more 11 personnel and has the 3 wide receivers. So there could be some room, right, for all 3 to produce. But again, you figure McMillan can do a lot of things outside and inside that these guys can do. They're getting a little bit older. I also think it's an insult to put him all the way down at wide receiver 29 where he is right now. That's almost at the end of the wide receiver 2s. I think you could go 4 or 5 spots higher at that position. Again, this is not a guy, as you mentioned, doesn't have the big injury. He did have that ACL a few years ago, but he's come back from that and he's produced pretty well. So, again, I think it's a little disrespectful for him down there. I think I'd rather have him in the, I'll say 22 to 25 range than 29. It's not a big adjustment, but enough to say it's going to be about a round difference in overall picks for Chris Godwin.
Yeah, I do think Chris Godwin could be a really good value if he sits here at wide receiver 30, where he is right now in consensus rankings. Just because, I mean, he's going to get the targets, right? I mean, yes, the Buccaneers defense stunk last year, so they had to throw a lot. And yeah, Jalen McMillan didn't break out yet, but his targets last year in the games he played, 8, 8, 9, 9, 6, 13, and 9. I don't expect this Buccaneers defense to, improve greatly over just from one off season, right? And yes, maybe Jalen McMillan just steals some targets, and I don't think he's going to average the 16 points per game like he did last year because that's really just not what he's done throughout his career. But I do think he can get in that 12, 13 point per game range, which would be a really nice value there as your wide receiver 3 that you can draft. He's going around Devonta Smith, Brandon Ayuk, Jalen Waddle, Chris Olave. Like, I do think, who would you rather go with, Devonta Smith or Chris Godwin? Because I actually really easily lean Devonta Smith, I guess, there.
Yeah, we'll see what the Eagles do about a third receiver. That's kind of a need for them in the draft or for the Dotson swap or whatever. So when they look at that and they say, hey, we don't really have number 3, Dallas Goedert, we might need to think about a tight end. So they're in transition there, which would say they're going to lean a little bit more on A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith than usual until they figure out those other spots. So that helps. But McMillan is a factor, and so is Otten to some degree. Like, they're going to use him in certain situations as well, maybe to steal some touchdowns or whatever. So when you look at that, I think there's a clearer path to targets there for Devonta Smith to have the bigger games versus Godwin, because he could be capped a little bit by what Mike Evans and McMillan do.
Our next toughest wide receiver to rank is Jameson Williams. He's sitting at wide receiver 22 in consensus rankings. That feels a bit rich to me. He was the wide receiver 20 in average points per game last year. But I mean, the Lions offense was thriving, right? They had the most offensive plays in the league last season. Now, no Ben Johnson. Their defense was in shambles, especially for the second half of last year, right? With all the injuries, with those key pieces coming back already, that defense should be better. So you would expect less offensive plays, or at least passing plays needed as well. I just think with the change of OC, with the defense getting a little bit better, we're not going to see these 8, 9, 10, 11 target games that we were saying that Jameson Williams was seeing last year. And it's more going to go more towards Amon-Ra St. Brown and just Sam Laporta, and Jameson Williams could kind of be that odd man out. I wouldn't drop him too far down, but wide receiver 22 is very rich in my mind.
Yeah, Jameson Williams is one of those buzz players that fantasy players just love, right? Because he makes big plays. He can take over a game in an instant with like some big weeks. Like, if he can put it all together, stretch the field, he doesn't need a lot of catches to have a big game. So that's why he's been very popular. And I think that bias is definitely seen here in this ranking at wide receiver 20, where, again, he's exciting. There's a lot of players above him that are not as exciting. So therefore, I think he gets a little bit of inflation here. But yeah, he's a little still big play dependent. I don't see him totally yet as that complete receiver that Amon-Ra St. Brown or Sam Laporta have been here for Jared Goff. Again, the Ben Johnson disappearance is maybe harder to scheme him to get open for those big plays. So I also think Lions might diversify a little bit with their passing game. We'll see what they add in the draft. But overall, you just look at this and say, he is a big play threat, and they use him in that way, and they had a lot of opportunities to hit on them with some of the matchups they had. They're not going to all come, and the volume is not going to always be there. So I think I would swap places with him and Godwin. Like, I would drop Godwin more into the late 20s and move I would move Williams down to the late 20s and move Godwin to the early 20s, kind of their trading places there, and then I would feel a bit more comfortable with each of their values.
Yeah, right now Jameson Williams is one spot. I had DJ Moore, who DJ Moore now has Ben Johnson. I won't be surprised if DJ Moore has about 50 more targets than Jameson Williams this year. So that would be a no-brainer for me if I was sitting on the board between DJ Moore and Jameson Williams. It would easily be the DJ Moore side. We have 2 more wide receivers to get to, Chris Olave and Jayden Reed. We will discuss our thoughts on them for 2025 after we take a break. All right, let's finish up today's show. I want to thank everybody for making Locked On Fantasy Football your first listen every day. We have 2 more wide receivers to discuss as the toughest guys to rank for 2025 fantasy football drafts. And the one of the 2 is Chris Olave. And he's been in the news this week because we had Kellen Moore talking up Chris Olave, who Kellen Moore is now the new head coach of the Saints. And he says he's made a huge impact on this team. He's going to have a huge impact this season. Now, coaches do typically talk up their players, especially at this time. But it does sound like, Chris Olave will be the focal point of this offense, which makes sense because really right now he's their only wide receiver. But it hasn't come to fruition for what we expected out of him in his career, especially last year. He was a wide receiver 56 in points per game, missed a good chunk of time, though, last year, 9 games. He's dealt with a lot of concussions throughout his short career, and that's also a worry. But he's only 25 years old. We know the talent and we know the targets that can be there for him, but also the touchdowns haven't been there for him even when the targets were there. So what are your thoughts on Chris Olave?
Yeah, he's right now at wide receiver 28, which seems kind of ludicrous given that he is still the number one receiver in New Orleans. I think people are worried about Derek Carr and whatever, if they're going to transition quarterbacks, will they go to someone in the draft, such as Quinn Ewers, and make that transition with Carr as the bridge? But I wouldn't be too worried because, again, you look at Rashid Shaheed, he's coming off a major injury. So we're looking at question mark there, like how effective he can be. Remember, Olave's injury is more linear, right? He was a concussion, just like Godwin, where we know we're not too worried. Dislocated shoulder, you can come back. Here, it's not a threatening injury in terms of his route running and all that good stuff, where Shaheed could be slowed down. I mean, he's a speedster who relies on quickness, while Olave is more of the cerebral guy that tries to get open and make some plays. So I think the Carr chemistry was a little fickle last year in the first year. And they were just like a little bit all over the place. I think he was better off when they had Jameis Winston throwing to him. But I still think he's too talented of a player. I think you look at him and Garrett Wilson coming out of Ohio State. I think Wilson gets the buzz, but I think Olave is the steadier, kind of the guy that can get open a little bit easier depending on kind of the volume. But also, I think he's less quarterback dependent, I'll say, than Garrett Wilson, where he is a little bit capable of getting open on himself, good separator here. So again, the only thing they did here, the Saints, well, they basically swap out, right? Marquez Valdes-Scantling followed Clint Kubiak to Seattle. And what did the Saints do? They brought back Brandon Cooks. Why not? Brandon Cooks comes back to his original team, so he's on that. So you're looking at Cooks and Shaheed, some question marks. Juwan Johnson was retained and re-signed at tight end. But still, Olave should dominate the targets here. For a guy that's going to dominate the targets, still be the number one, I still think 28 is a little too low for me. I think I'm going to move him right where the Godwin range is. So that's why I'm getting the Chris's mixed up, because I'm liking both of them here in the early 20s in fantasy drafts.
Yeah, and I mentioned he played 8 games, but really 2 of those games he played less than 10 snaps before he left the game. So if you just take out those 2 games, I mean, he did have more than 80 receiving yards in 4 of those 6 games that he actually played. They're solid enough fantasy games where you were not disappointed. One good fantasy day in there with 18 points, and then a 13-point game, a 15-point game. You're happy with that, an 11-point game, and then 2 bad games in there as well. So I do think his ranking right now in the low 20s is a bit low for him, especially when in 2023, he was the wide receiver 21 in points per game. I think that's more of a fair range for him. Low end wide receiver 2. You're not like thrilled about it. You wouldn't want him to be your wide receiver 1 on your roster, but he could be a pretty solid wide receiver 2 and have good value there for him in drafts. The last guy we want to discuss is Jayden Reed. And we know we're not going to rank him high, right? That's not the issue. It's just how low is too low for Jayden Reed? Is he even a guy we want on our rosters, right? He was the wide receiver 38 in fantasy points per game last year. He's turning 25 years old, so still very young. The consensus ranking has him at wide receiver 34, so very close to what he did last season. But last season, I mean, it started so strong. First week, blew up 31 fantasy points. And then you didn't have Jordan Love for a little bit. And then he gets Jordan Love back and he goes off again right away with Jordan Love for a 24-point game. And we're like, okay, as long as he has Jordan Love, he's great. But then pretty much the rest of the year, he gives you very, very little besides a couple games here and there where he scored in the teens because of some touchdowns. What do we do with Jayden Reed? Because it feels like if he was going to truly break out, it would have been last year when they really needed a wide receiver to step up.
Yeah, and he's a bit of a gadget player. We know that he can get some things rushing, and that was his big padding of stats as a rookie, where he did get some significant numbers that were rushing, including some scoring opportunities. So when you look at Reed, again, he's right where he is last year. That's usually not a great sign, right? If there's some fluctuation, then there's like an opinion. But this says there's not a lot of opinion or thought about Jayden Reed. Like, we'll just plop him right about where he was last year, 34 to 40, somewhere there. And like, we'll just go with that. Well, here's a problem with Reed. I mean, I don't think it's going to be duplicated here because they're probably looking to overhaul this receiving core again. I mean, they've given these guys some opportunity here between him and Christian Watson and Romeo Doubs. I mean, they just haven't been able to all stay healthy at the same time and work with Jordan Love. So I really think the Packers might break their first round unwillingness to take a wide receiver. That could change things. If they draft one in the first round, then I think I'm on that player and pretty much off everyone else here in this Packers passing game because they do like to spread it around quite a bit. Don't forget about Tucker Kraft at tight end. We'll see about Luke Musgrave, what they do with him, but it has been kind of a receiver spread it around type, and they're all young where that still makes it inexperienced here for Jordan Love. So the games can be based on the matchups and not just, okay, we're going to go through this progression and this guy's our number one, right? It's more who's the guy that can go get open. Is it deep outside? Is it working short to me in the slot? Oftentimes it was Reed being the beneficiary of that because he's a good slot receiver. So I just want to see what the Packers do in the draft, but I just don't see him being treated like the number one, right? I think he was out of necessity. We'll see. Again, it could materialize if Watson and Doubs have more injury issues. They don't get aggressive in getting a receiver. So this is the hardest guy to rank for me. I like the talent. I don't like the usage, and I don't like the situation.
Yeah, there's guys much lower than him in the rankings, like Jacoby Myers and Ricky Pearsall, and even like Juwan Jennings or Cooper Kupp. Like, I'd rather all take a chance on any of them than go with Jayden Reed. So Jayden Reed, even though he's ranked at wide receiver 34, which is low, I'm going to have him even lower than that. The issue right now is how much lower, and I think he'll be somewhere in the high 40s, right? It's not going to be crazy low, but he's not going to be a guy, even if he keeps dropping in drafts, that I'm going to feel the need to draft unless it's just he goes way too far down. But that is it for today's episode. I want to thank you all for making Locked On Fantasy Football your first listen today. For your second listen, check out the Locked On NFL Draft with Damian Parson and Keith Sanchez. Now that the season is over, get the latest draft rankings, rumors, and news every day. Find Locked On NFL Draft on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. We will be getting to our toughest top 6 quarterbacks to rank on tomorrow's show and then tight ends on Friday's show. Don't miss it. Bye, y'all.